Ura, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for taking this time to talk with me about your work in many different capacities. It's a complete thrill to be here talking with you. And I feel like we've been having this ongoing, it's all been one conversation for a long time about some of these topics that we'll discuss today. And hopefully this will be an interesting slice of that. So I'm hoping to talk about your poetry, about your translation practice, about your editing and stewardship of others' poetry. But maybe we can start with a really particular question. And I was curious about your poem, Foneticando, in which you are writing in a kind of phonetic spelling, both in English and in Spanish, heading maybe off in different directions in some ways. But if you can just talk about what you were doing in that poem and what brought you to write in that way in that poem, and maybe other works that you were thinking of or in dialogue with when you were writing it.
Sure. Well, first, thank you so much for your ongoing dialogue with and beyond my work over so many years. In terms of Foneticanto, there are many references and points of contact. One of those is the phonetic experimentation of Pedro Pietri, who, as you know, is a mentor. But there's a really specific reference here that is Clemente Soto Vélez's Mujer u Hombre, Hombre u Mujer, posthumous book. And Clemente had explored different kinds of phonetic writing throughout his career. I think there's a tradition, you could think about it all the way back to Juan Ramón Jiménez, who, although he was from Spain, right, had a significant influence in Puerto Rico from all the time he lived there. So Clemente, played around with phonetic writing, throughout his work. But then ultimately it's this posthumously published book, right, that really struck me because it felt like a performance text. It was thinking from and beyond a gender binary, mujer o hombre, hombre o mujer. It was also defamiliarizing phonetic writing. So he does things like, I think he uses like K's instead of C's famously. So he would spell his own name sometimes with a K instead of a C. And I don't know that he always follows his own rules. So it's a little quirky. I don't know how much of that was deliberate, but it felt like a performative approach to phonetic writing that was quite unlike anything else I had come across, specifically in poetry from Puerto Rico, although of course Clemente lived in New York for a long time. So I'm guessing that it was a book that he wrote mainly in New York. I mentioned that book in passing in the introduction to Invisible Movement, right? Because it also has this poetics of contradicción, I think spelled with I think it's KS, dicción, right? Sort of contradict, but to speak against in another way, right? So it's a book that really fascinated me for a long time. And with my translingual imagination, I thought, well, what would happen if I tried something like that, but then in both languages, right? And I think there's a long-standing interest there in my work in just the vernacular dimensions, specifically tied to my personal history, right? So my dad from California, who never lost his accent in Spanish, así que hablaba español con acento, and my mom has her accent in English. And so that sense of the quirky, performative, but affect-loaded English and Spanish, neither of which are standard, right? But do this other kind of work. And that's where I think Pietri comes in, and I think, what is it, Beware of Signs, I think one of those, right? Where he does this parody of the voice of the Anglo salesman, right? Hola, television sets, right? So I really felt like I could reflect on these embodied vernaculars in a new way while trying out that Clementian, Sotovelezian, right, mode of phonetic writing. And I think it ended up being a little bit like his in the sense that I'm not sure that the experiment was wholly successful, but I think I was also trying to think about the limits of transcription as a poetics, which has become a part of my work ever since I started really always, but especially since I started taking the walkie-talkie improvisational poems more seriously. So in other words, if you think about this as performative, in a way, you are not performance in the special sense, right, of a public program or something like that, but more a kind of writing that documents the way we perform language in the everyday, than trying to put on the page, right, what these words sound like, right, in my English and my Spanish. Then I think there's an element of performativity, right, just in the practice of transcription, right. I think that maybe that's one way to think about them, is imperfect explorations, right, of the limits of transcription as a poetics, and what remains untranscribable, perhaps, right. So there's cases in Clementes where you're like, ooh, would you say the sound, right, when we in Puerto Rican Spanish, right, you wouldn't say por, you'd say pol, right? And so what would you put an H, would you put an L, right, would you just leave it out? So there's a sense also of just the limits, right, of transcription as a way of capturing the complexity of embodied vernaculars.
And the specificity of Puerto Rican Spanish.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Although I think I wrote that kind of just before I started dialoguing with someone like Roque Racasalas Rivera's work. I think I would have done it differently. And I think, I think Roque is just so brilliant and brilliantly political in almost demanding, right, on the untranslatability of a certain Boricua English and Spanish. And so there's Spanish, I should say, right? And I think there's that. But interestingly, that's not Clemente, right? I think his phonetics feels a lot more just quirky, right? And so without a lot of, it's hard to know what it means politically. Of course, we know he was anti-colonial, right, and a nationalist, and was jailed as such, right, and published his first book while imprisoned. So I think the politics of his work are obvious, but exactly how this really quirky work grafts onto the politics is something that's always fascinated me. And again, this was before I became a member of the board of the Clemente Soto Vélez Cultural Center, which was a space where we began, performing back when, we had a band and, at a different moment. But it was a space that was really important to me in terms of my, my creative and community evolution. So it's an honor to be, involved with a space that's been so important to me, but also such a stalwart, right, for the Latin American and Latinx community in New York. But I'm always struck by that this, Clemente is claimed as this great man. Yeah. But ultimately the work is just so weird, right? And I think I wanted to linger with the weirdness of it, and maybe there's a little bit of a tribute to that, and in how I think about self-translation, right, as this imperfect attempt, right, to self-translate an already imperfect practice of transcription.
That's really well put. Okay, so I want to ask you 4 different follow-ups. If you could talk about the walkie-talkie techies and explain how that got started, but then also want to keep going with the self-translation part as well. So choose your own adventure for...
I mean, I can talk about walkie-talkie techie. There's many strains of that. I think I mentioned the importance of Josefina Baez's work early on. I was living in Washington Heights, right, in Upper Manhattan, where at a time when Josefina was doing all this really exciting work there. And I was really struck by the way she was incorporating technology into her performances and using video less like in a documentary way than in a generative way, if that makes sense. Yeah. So almost there was really not a lot of editing to this. There were like these, I don't think there was any editing, right? There were just these snippets of what you could do, right, back in the mid-2000s on YouTube. And so there was a sense of rawness, right, that now as someone who writes about social media, I could talk about in terms of amateur cinema on YouTube. I forget the names of the scholars who write about this, right? But the sense also that the modesty, the technology that was being used in a paradoxical way foregrounded the richness of the city and of the body, of the embodied city in that sense, and of Josefina's really resistant, translingual, right, diasporic, processual, experimental performance poetics, which has been a big influence on my work and something that I teach often. So there's that. Often when you were a scholar of poetry performance, you end up relying on something like YouTube, which again was never meant to be an archive, but as I think it's Burgess and Green, the two scholars who write about YouTube as an accidental archive, right? So YouTube was meant to go viral and to be monetized, but somehow, despite that, you get people like Josefina, right? Somewhere in the depths of YouTube, right? With 300 views or 500 views or 2,000 views, right? In a very modest in terms of views, but really, really to me fascinating in terms of just almost the way it works against the slickness of a certain kind of digital performance, right?
And that's what you were going for as well?
I think I was inspired by that.
Yeah.
I think I was also trying to go to a deeper place in my work, right? I felt I had begun teaching at SUNY Albany after doing my PhD, which was kind of like, they call it like the little sibling to SUNY Buffalo, right, as this kind of experimental program. So just being in the beautiful position, right, of being in an experimental program like that and just having the freedom to question, right, a lot of the ways in which I had been approaching poetry up to that time. I think delving deeper into performance studies, a lot of these things coincided.
Yeah.
And then, of course, I think the wider availability of smartphones, that was definitely one part of it.
Did you start using the smartphone? You must have. What did you use in the beginning? Okay. Yeah.
Embarrassingly, it was a BlackBerry at first, right? But then
that's what it was.
But then we moved on from that
Yeah.
to, I think, Androids and iPhones and pretty much all over, right? So I think it also coincided with beginning to work at Albany. And I'd had this joke on my website about being a stateless poet, which was, again, now it seems like a term that deserves more glossing or more care, right? Thinking about the many ways statelessness could be interpreted, right? And the many privileges, right, that inform my work. But I think I was thinking also about, as I think I put it on my website, statelessness as a kind of alternative to a poetics of statement, a poetics of declaration. And I wanted to think about no declaración, sino lo no claro, the unclear, right? And so making room for process was very liberating. I remember, I think I've mentioned it before in interviews, right? How much pressure I think I put on myself looking back as someone who began performing the New Rican Poets Cafe in the context of the heyday of slam.
Yeah.
And everybody was so slick and so tight and they had it all so together. And I felt like such a loser, right? And I saw people like come on the scene and they'd have an agent in 3 months and they'd be doing their thing and I was doing my weird little poems and asking, mentioning that to Pedro Pietri right before he passed. And Pedro, in his very kind of brilliantly impatient way, say, we're Puerto Rican. We've been improvising our poetry for centuries. Don't let them tell you how it's supposed to be done. You do your thing, right? And that really felt validating, right? And so I thought, okay, I shouldn't worry about what the expectations are. I need to find my own way, right? And so along with that, I think I started really wanting to explore what I now call the body mind. I don't think I had that vocabulary. So also thinking about, beyond a certain kind of modality of performance poetics to just more embrace process, right, in my work. And I started doing it for fun, just playing around with it, improvising. And I hated the results as poems, so I was doing it more for fun. But then I realized I found it oddly liberating, right? Just to be unencumbered from the expectations, right, of poetic quality, perhaps. And I always joke that I also became a a digital poet because of neoliberalism, right? For the most neoliberal reasons. And basically I was also on the tenure track at SUNY Albany, and I had to work on my tenure book. And I thought, okay, I have no trouble composing stuff. My process is very generative, so I can crank stuff out, but I have no time to edit. I can either revise and work on the painstaking work of scholarship, or I can revise my poems, but I can't do both. And as you probably know, I've been doing a lot of, decimas and sonnets and all these forms that demand the kind of formal care. I'm like, I can't do that right now, so I need to become, right, some kind of conceptualist, some kind of found poet, some kind of, framer, right, of whatever it was that was around me. So around the same time I started doing Wokidokitekis, I started doing stuff with found text, like the Piñatari poem and High Density Politics, right?
Yeah.
And I think that book, High Density Politics, was really a breakthrough in that sense. I think those are the first Wokidokitekis are there, the Guanica poems there, right? And a part of it was because I wanted to publish a book. It had been a while. I'd published Borinquen in 2008, but Borinquen was supposed to come out in 2005. So it's older poems.
Yeah.
But the press had folded and it had taken a few years for it to get republished. So at that point, it's going on 2010. It is 2010, and I hadn't published like new material, right, in what felt like an eternity at that time, and I just thought, okay, I'm going to gather all the stuff that I have together and see how I can make this work.
Yeah.
And in a way, it was the most anti-poetic book that I can think of. And I kind of had a blast doing it, right? So giving myself the freedom for process to become an end in itself, right? As opposed to a means to craft. Some of that was a genuine artistic decision. Some of it was based on the constraints on my time. And eventually, once I got tenure, I was able to come back to writing sonnets and all the other lovely things that we get in transversal. Those are the work of someone who has tenure, right? So those real things do matter. But I think also, obviously, my practice of walking, right? I think I mentioned in the event we just did that I'd always been interested in the poetics of walking as a city person, and also as someone, right, neurodivergent who, because I have epilepsy, I never drove, right? And that's one thing if you're in New York, but it's something else if you're in, even San Juan, right? In the pre-Uber days, right? A lot of like long bus rides and bus stops in the middle of nowhere, and in the heat, that's not always a lot of fun. So I just became used to this very kind of playfully disciplined practice of walking, and of just embracing the walk is going to take me. I'm also, because of my my neurodivergence, I'm not the person with the best sense of direction, so I'd end up in all kinds of weird places. And getting lost while walking is a big part of just my day-to-day life. And I think a lot of my poetry has always been informed, right, by processes of walking. And I'd be the person who has a little notebook, and would be taking notes while walking, or go to a cafe after walking, and then write based on on the walks that I had just taken. But then I think the emergence of smartphones, right, my sense of a certain incapacity to find the time to edit, a certain desire inspired by people like Beatriz, and frustrated by the constraints of this kind of performance poetry or that kind of performance poetry, to find my own way, right? I started just experimenting with that. And I think there's also a side of me that always wanted to do more, I call it like process prose, right? And that's closer to the work I'm doing now in Neural C. So that was the first time that I felt, okay, this feels like, it can be process prose, and it doesn't have to be poetry, right? And I was interested in the prose poem as a genre, but I never knew what I wanted prose poems to do. I like reading them, I like teaching them. Even everything from Baudelaire, Ashbery's flow chart, like you name it, right? A wide range. Obviously, I'm stuff like Midwinter Day, which I taught a lot in my early days in Albany, because she was a big deal up there, right? My Life, right? So there was this tradition. It tended to be a very white tradition, right? And so, but then you also had people like Juan Felipe Herrera, Giraffe on Fire, right? So the prose poem, the process prose, and the long poem are not the same thing, but I think they became part of a overlapping exploration. Obviously, there were people like Stein also there as part of that. Williams, right? Messy early Williams, Coronel, right? A book that I kind of hate read a lot. I oftentimes I find those are my most sustaining relationships, is with writers that I have where there's something unresolved in my relationship to those writers, and so I keep reading, like trying to find out what I think about them, and sometimes writing an essay is enough. With Williams, it hasn't been, so I keep teaching him, hoping I'll figure out what to do with it. I think he also has the whole Anglo dad, Puerto Rican mom thing going on, so there was that, right? And the sense of thinking about a Boricua modernism to echo Lisa Sanchez Gonzalez. So I knew I had, I was writing about the Nuyorican tradition, but what else is there, right? And so there was something really just like weirdly processual about early Williams that kind of haunted the work that I was doing. So I would teach a lot of this work, trying to also just figure it out for myself, and I'm not sure that I ever quite did. But I think then when I started actually sharing some of these transcriptions, we could talk about that in a second, because there's the actual recording of the Walkie-Talkie-Teki, and because I wasn't thinking of them as meant to be published, they were one-offs, right? And initially it took a while. So the first few times it was halting, I'd start improvising, I'd mess up, and I'd start all over again. But pretty quickly, by the first, I'd say, week, I was like, okay, once you start, you keep going. It doesn't matter how much you mess up. And that felt also very, very affirming, right? That there's no wrong, right? Edwin Torres would have been, he doesn't do that kind of work, but the sense of that Brian Eno sense, right? Honor your error as your hidden intention, right? Is something also that I held on to. It's like, if it's wrong, it'll be right for whatever this has to be, right? That just hippie faith in the process will find a way forward. And I started sharing some of that work with some friends, including the translator Christian Dijkstra, who got me folded into Mandorla, which was a very important project for me as a translator. And she and others started mentioning, wow, you're kind of going places in this work that are not only just formally interesting, but sometimes they're vulnerable, they're raw, right? They're not as encumbered by just the architectures of form, right? That had been so much a part of some of my other work. So it also felt freeing. It's like, wow, I don't have to worry about rhyme schemes or having some big formal concept. I'm just going to let it rip. And the last influence would be Fall of America, Ginsberg. So I was always struck by the fact that it was this book of, you never know how much of this is true, but as I understand, poetic improvisations done on a tape recorder and presented as a book arranged in chronological order, in the order they were improvised. Again, I'm not sure how faithful that is, right, to the actual process of composition. But I think that concept struck me, especially because one of the influences for Ginsberg there was Whitman, right? And I think the subtitle is The Fall of America, Poems of These States. Oh. And that really fit my kind of stateless poetics, right? And I thought, what are these states for me? Like these geopolitical states, but also I was living on State Street in Albany, right? And I was thinking about poetics of statement and unstatement. And one of the big models in this kind of innovative process poetics as well was the mid-70s work of Victor Hernandez Cruz.
Oh, yeah.
Right, who has that, I think the poem is called Aeroplane, right, that I use as an epigraph, which is no state ever a thing, something like that, right? So that sense of reclaiming through Victor Hernandez Cruz's work a certain genealogy of no state, right? Edwin Torres also has a book called Yes Thing, No Thing. Yeah. So that was also a part of it, that, identity is both a negation and an affirmation. At a time when people were like railing against identity politics, I'm like, what if negation is my identity? And that's part of what can happen in improvisation. I can be one thing and then be another, and take identities on and off, and just play and not be bound, right, to the kind of burdens of representation, to the burdens of statement, right? I can make a statement and I can walk it back, right? And so there was a really kind of processual freedom to that. And then as folks started responding, right, to the kind of emotional tenor and the formal.
And there's almost an intimacy.
Yeah, the intimacy.
Right?
Well, it was part of it. I tended to notice myself breathe, notice myself. So really for someone who can be in their own head a lot, there was something really just like grounding about this, right? I was thinking a lot about breath, inspired by, my research into the Nuyorican poets, right? And I mentioned Pedro Pietri, right? Turn off the radio this country gave you. It is out of order. Your breath is your promised land. Genius,
it's amazing.
right? Yeah.
It's amazing.
So
yeah, so good.
So thinking as a diasporic person, right, is and from his also kind of anti-capitalist perspective, right? All that commodified vision, right? Ground yourself in your breath. That was who was there? Josefina Baez, right? Who's coming from this meditation background. And then when I bring her to classes, she gets my students and myself meditating, right? So, that's become more and more, but as you grow older, it becomes more and more of a spiritual imperative, a desire to ground yourself. And of course, geopolitical events have made that a more kind of ritual, eventually became a ritual part of my practice beyond just any expectations of, art or productivity. It became something I did for myself, which is also very Josefina Baez. Just like, this is what you do. You keep doing and you keep doing it. And if it becomes a book, that's great. If it doesn't, it's just part of the ritual, right? And then eventually, weirdly enough, I started exhibiting some of that work at galleries. So it became also as part of this multimedia practice, and eventually of things like making GIF or GIF, I never know how it's pronounced, poems, right? And so of a kind of totally anti-virtuosic, unskilled digital poetic, which I love it because so much of my work at least performs a certain formal dexterity. I love it that with tech, I have absolutely no skills. And so I can just like fail spectacularly, but have a blast doing it. So when you're on the 10-year track and you're stressed out, you're like, ooh, I love this. I'm just going to be, which is what I felt when I had a band. I'm like, I can't sing, but I'm just going to go for it, right? So that sense of also just like play, and if it's a hot mess, let it be the beautiful hot mess that it needs to be.
Well, I'm so struck in this like incredibly rich answer that you've just given. Like this, no, really, it's this. It's not a tension actually between like constraint and freedom. It seems like a coexistence. It's so interesting that you're saying like this set of rituals that you created for yourself, it had parameters, and you gave yourself rules. Like once I start, I'm going to keep going. I'm not going to keep restarting, right? I'm going to just take it as one take and so forth. You created these rules, but it allowed you a kind of liberation. It allowed you some kind of freedom to make and not get hung up on various things. So like those things were kind of intermixed, and I was talking with my students about how constraints, it seems like a way to put language in a cage, but actually it can often be generative and produce things. And I feel like that's a great segue to thinking about translation, because translation is like writing under constraints so much of the time. You have translated very different poets. You translated the how do I even gloss him quickly? But the Chilean sort of iconic vanguard, iconoclastic poet Pablo de Roca, and Winston Gonzalez, who's a contemporary Garifuna poet from Guatemala, and Amanda Berenguer, and Nicole Cecilia Delgado from Puerto Rico, and Berenguer from Uruguay. So poets from very different places speaking in different Spanishes and from different moments in history. A couple contemporary poets and some sort of historical writers who loom large in the imagination. I'd love to invite you to think about what the practice of translation has meant for you and for your own writing, and sort of, well, there's so many different parts to that. How do you pick these authors to translate? I know some of them you spend a very long time with, like De Roca. You translate a huge book of his. So really any part of that you want to pick up about your translation practice and how it connects with, and one last thing, and these are Latin American poets who you're translating. You're not translating poets from Spain, you're not translating,
Maybe one entry point into that, thinking about the poetry and the translation, might be Haroldo de Campos, right? And so obviously his concept of transcreation, right, as a kind of critical creative practice, but also the Woki-Toki-Tekis coincided with having kind of done the deep dive into his Galaxias and other writings. So just the philosophy of the Galaxias, right? This work that is, on the one hand, about the epitome of translingual play, right? 17 languages and this Tower of Babel, right? But there's this rigor, right? There's a page of block text with no punctuation, and then the next page is blank.
Yeah.
Right. So it felt like this vertiginous, right? Almost like death and life. Right. You almost like kill all the life out of the writing, but then almost like, right, from the dead, right? You're haunted, right, by these afterlives of language. What is it? What does he call it? Pulsão bioescritural en objeto, right? So bioscriptural, biowriterly, right? Pulsation, right? Or pulse, objectified, or as object. I'm not sure quite how you translate that, but so that felt like something that drew me to translation. I wanted to understand like the pulse of language, of my own language, but then thinking about the pulse of others' writing. And so if you think about a text that came to you already published as a kind of dead text, in a sense, coming from a Nuyorican tradition where, you really value that transformation before the public eye, if you could do that, right? And of course, I'm someone who has the privilege of having this very canonical training, but also this performance life. I'm like, why am I still drawn to this experimental work on the page when I could be doing all this cool performance stuff? I'm like, oh, there's something about how, yes, the work has been, you've killed the vitality out of it to put it on a page, but somehow it comes back to us, right, as in this newly vital form as readers, right?
Through your translation.
And so I thought of translation as a way less to get the writers right than to explore for myself how the process, right, of summoning, right, that biotic force of writing worked, right? And I think I had an intellectual interest in translation, but I'm embarrassed to say, like, there's so many anti-colonial answers I could give you, but they would not be honest, right? So it's a very unsexy answer. I took a translation workshop as a grad student at NYU with what was the professor's name? I want to say Kathleen Ross. I don't know what she ended up doing or what became of her, but there were a few of us who ended up actually, who had already published some translations. I hadn't,
Yeah.
I think maybe I just started working with Mandola. I can tell that story in a second, right?
Yeah.
But I certainly didn't see myself as publishing a book of translations. It felt like something so remote and so far removed. And I was doing a PhD. How do you even find the time to do that? But a couple of things happened. I think I took that workshop, and she told us, kind of translate whatever the heck you want. And this is how I think colonized my thinking was. I'm like, who's the most famous writer that I'm kind of interested in that I can think of that hasn't been translated? And I thought of De Roca. I don't think I had a deeper, he's Chilean, I'm Puerto Rican. And I think the fact that it was like a dead man from the Southern Cone, right? I'm like, really? I couldn't think of someone, closer to home, or with, not that I wasn't fascinated by De Roca's work, but I think I thought of it in these very like canonical ways, like who, translation is insertion into another element of the canon, right? I just hadn't even questioned it, right? And then I think reading all around the same time as I got deeper into the translation helped
canonical, but also so weird. I mean, De Roca is such a weird poet, right? His vocabulary, his syntax, his rhythms, right? He's not Pablo Neruda. He's the opposite of that kind of like pure lyrical.
They've been presented as
and prose
enemies,
poems and fragments. Yeah, I know. And if this were in a Chilean context, it'd be a different conversation. But it's interesting that you chose him as canonical, and yet he was like a really weird canonical writer. Yeah.
But I think those are the people that I'm interested in general, right? As people kind of, people who are even outsiders in their own. That's kind of the stateless, right? Poet. If you think of Neruda as a kind of poet of the state in Chile, who was a diplomat and all that, right? De Roca, who had many, many problems, and I go into it, right? In my framing of the translation, but I think he was a kind of punk model for a certain kind of politically engaged poetics, but I don't think I was thinking that deeply. I'm like, this is kind of fun, let me go for it. And I kind of forgot about it, right? Around the same time, maybe a little bit before that, I'd gone to a conference, I want to say in Puebla, maybe it was LASA or ACLA, one of those, right? And that's where I connected with Kristen Dykstra, right? And she, I think we were both laughing about just the the hegemony of the experimental world, and it seemed like so refreshing to talk to someone whose horizons went beyond, right, these like US-centered debates, right, but also someone who wasn't just coming at it from a canonical Latin American perspective. So that kind of perspectiva hemisférica, right, it felt close to home. And so by joining, right, as a contributing editor of Mandorla, right, and connecting, obviously with Roberto Tejada, Daniel Borsutsky, a lot of the folks who Kristen brought into the fold, right, it was a really beautiful opportunity. I think Kristen tasked me also with getting more Caribbean folks, especially Caribbean women, right, into the anthology. And so I did that as contributing editor, but also I'd be like a translator whenever I could help out with stuff that I had lying around. I'd done some translations, like just to help people out for magazines, but I didn't really think a lot about it. I think it was in Mandorla that I'm like, ooh, okay, wow, there's, I have to bring the same kind of critical rigor that I bring to my critical work. First, because these people are all brilliant, but also because of the range and scope of work that we're publishing, right? There's this broader conversación hemisférica that we're having that couldn't be just a one-off that you were doing for a magazine or something. So I started thinking, okay, translation is something else that I do, right? And obviously having gone to NYU for my PhD, and there was Hemi, the work of Diana Taylor, right? So that sense that I wanted to work across the Americas. I was in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese doing US Latinx work. So I feel like institutionally, it was always that tricky balancing act, right? Of this very Latin Americanist training with this very kind of US Latinx multi-ethnic focus. And I feel like Mandorla was important to re-spatializing, right? Some of those maps, right? I think I also tried to bring more, maybe more ethnic work, if that's even a work, right? Or work that felt less like of the lettered city, more performance-oriented work as well.
Into
right?
Mandorla.
Into Mandorla, yeah. So I think it was really, I learned a lot from that process. So anyway, I did the Mandorla thing. I finished my PhD. I forgot about Terroca. I was on a Word doc there somewhere. And then I end up on the 10-year track at SUNY Albany. And of course, who's the senior poet there? Pierre Joris, who just passed. And so whom I consider, along with Kristen, right, as one of my mentors in translation, right? And so obviously Pierre himself, just this force of nature, right? I still think of Pierre like, doing fly out gigs, for his students, right? And then seemingly taking on every little reading, every translation. I'm like, how do you do this, right? It's really, really
a lot of energy.
Impressive, right? But he was a true believer, right? That this work mattered. I love that he also thought of himself, he was European, but he also thought of himself as working in these like borderlands of Europe and as unsettling these imperial languages, right? So as someone who was already kind of a Glissantian and had audited that class with Glissan at the Graduate Center, I really thought, oh, this is a model for how you can work within, right, these very, imperial histories, right? But end up somewhere else. And of course, just the level of like commitment to his craft, right? So just that Celan, right? A poet I never understood until I read Pierre Celan. I'm like, wow, this is why people think he's so incredible. Look at all this neologistic imagination, right? I think Pierre actually transcreated, right? The kind of syntactical innovations, the personal language, right? Celan has this like personal language,
which is something that you do with the Roca.
Absolutely,
as well.
So Pierre and I worked together. We co-advised the online literary magazine that the grad students ran, and he was very generous and would invite you over. And so as part of that, I got the courage, right, to show him my Derroca as, this little thing that I did. And he's like, oh, you should publish this. And I thought, really? But it was a little chunk, right, from one book of Derrocas, right? He's like, no, if you're going to publish it, they're going on to be a selected. It's never been like a selected. I could barely get through this. And that became 10 years of my life, kind of. Not knowing what I did not know, and looking back, I could have, I would change a lot of things, but it was really an incredible education in translation, a humbling, in a trial by fire in a way in translation.
What did you learn about translation from the process?
Situating myself, archives and the lack thereof, right? Obviously, as a Puerto Rican person, translating a Chilean person who was also from rural Chile, who was a surrealist, who self-published. I'm like, okay, I don't understand this word. Do I understand it because it's a Chilean word? Because it's a Chilean word from the 1920s?
Right.
Because it's a surrealist? Or because this person self-published and sometimes it's just a typo, right?
Yeah.
or fifth reason, because he then revised his own work, right, across the many editions. So maybe it was something else in another edition that we don't know about, right? So I think it also made me kind of aware of how important translation was, right, to a so-called Poetics of the Americas, right? So I think probably you and I are of the age when that was the dream of Poetics of the Americas. I'm like, how does that work? Who's doing the translating for all that to happen, right? And I think even though De Roca didn't incorporate, right, a lot of, say, indigenous languages, he certainly incorporated, right, the flora, the fauna, some of the culture of indigenous Chile, right, into his work. And that made me really think about, okay, the lettered city is not enough, right? So you have to think about what is untranslatable, what does not fit within this cosmopolitan, elite vision of Latin American literature as it freely circulates, right? And so reading Angel Rama again, I'm like, oh, okay. So yeah, so like Black and indigenous histories, right, have never been privileged, right? It's a certain kind of elite cosmopolitanism, right, that shapes the lettered city then and now, right? So that eventually became a kind of ethics that I bring to my pedagogy, to my curation, right? Is how to think about who gets left out. Having been trained in a very kind of, you know, traditional area studies, Latin Americanism, I think translation helped me think about the borderlands of that training, right? And so translating borderlands poets in the U.S. context or whatever, Triple Frontera, Guarani, you know, or Portuguese.
Like, for
right?
example, Winston Gonzalez or Nicole.
Absolutely. Well, that happened later. I think it took me for me being ready to even go there, right? To me figure out that these were my commitments, right?
How did you come to translate Winston?
That was on spec, right? So Jadine Pluker, she reached out to me, and I'm not sure I want to get this right. My understanding is that they had already, Ugly Duckling Press, right, their editorial team, had already pre-selected, right, the texts that were going to be in No Voodoo Please.
Okay.
And so I was just a translator for hire, right? And initially, when approached by Jadine, I said no, right? I'm like, I'm not even Central American, much less Garifuna. I don't know this person at all. I'm busy. And then eventually I read through the work, and then I think I WhatsApped with Winston, and I thought, wow, where did this person come from? What a force of nature. What a sweetheart.
So good.
His work it reminded me of the Nuyorican poets I was influenced by. It felt like it had cobbled a way for itself into the world, right, when there weren't even a lot of institutional horizons for work like that. So performance, linguistic experimentation, thinking about embodied vernaculars wasn't a gimmick. It was part of like finding a way into the world for work like this, right? And I think eventually we spoke, and I realized, okay, I can't do justice to the Garifuna in this. And he told me, don't worry about it. We're not going to translate the Garifuna anyway. But then I still wanted to know what it meant so I could bring that into our conversations. And then I thought, okay, I connected to the Caribbeanness, I think, in Winston's work. And he had references to Tego Calderón and all that. And oh, that's really cool. And I realized not just the Caribbeanness, but the rhythm of his work, right? And I think I started using my training as a scholar of poetry performance and studying as much as I could about, well, videos of this person reading their work. How would you read this? How would you? It all happened very quick because it was under deadline, right? And I kind of cranked it out, which seems to me sometimes how I do the best work. Like I spent 3 weeks on No Voodoo Please and 10 years on the De Roca, and I feel like people are still talking about Winston's work. So eventually, and of course, Winston does all this stuff with, again, phonetic writing that, again, is sometimes non-standard or incorrect, and sometimes that's by design. Sometimes it's typos that he leaves in, right? So he has this also very like unfinished processual, and that feels very Afro-diasporic. Now that I understand it more, it feels also very much part of a Garifuna tradition that is largely oral, And so in that sense, the print text, right, is a kind of impossible archive, right, for this living, breathing tradition. But then I thought, okay, how do I do justice to this aspect of this key aspect of his work? And I settled on like doing a kind of dub poetry hybrid. And so I just started thinking about dub poetry and kind of the creolization poetics, right, of dub poetry in conversation with people like Kamal Brathwaite, right, and just got some stuff clear conceptually, and then started playing, and that was
that's when the magic happens.
Yeah. I mean, it would happen similarly with Amanda Berenguer when Kristen Dykstra asked me to do the concrete and visual poems of Berenguer's for Materia Prima. Again, they had something absurd, like, I think I took 10 days to do the.
Are you kidding me? Oh my God.
Which was basically being shut in and doing nothing else.
You know how to work under
between
pressure.
Dissertation chapters. Yeah. I think I did back then. I'm not sure that I could do any of that now. I think I also, I don't know, I was flattered to be included. I don't think I ever felt like really part of a translation community. I did in the sense that I was working with Mandorla, but I don't think I had the awareness that there were like communities of socially engaged translators the way there are now. Maybe there weren't, I didn't know them, but I certainly wasn't sustained by them outside of my work for Mandorla, which was largely via email. So it's not like I was hanging out with translators and we were talking about these issues, right? So it always felt weird when I was approached. Really, me? You want me to do this? Okay, I'll try my best, right? And again, with Berenguer, I'm like, I'm not Uruguayan. What do I know about this work, right? But by that point, I trusted people like Kristen, right, enough where I'm like, she's gonna put me in a good situation, and she thinks I can do this. I'm gonna go for it, right? So it was a relief when I finally got around to translating Nicole Cecilia Delgado, because I'm like, here is a translation. I had met Nicole in New York, actually, right? My roommate was friends with her, and so she came by the house and they hung out, and she was like making books even back then, right? But she was also hanging out at the New Rican Poets Cafe more with the kind of Colombian and other Latin American poets there who wrote in Spanish, one of the many, and largely from this kind of anarchist squat, right, scene. So we connected and we did some events together, and I would read when she would do some stuff, and I liked her a lot. But I'm not sure that I had a sense of who she would become, right? She went to Mexico and she came back as this really incredible kind of figura hemisférica, right? Who learned to make cartoneras there, right? And eventually Rizo, right? And came back to Puerto Rico, started Atarraya Cartonera, then La Impresora, and really has become one of the key, cultural workers and activists. So there it was easy because it was the personal was paramount, right? And to me, translating Nicole was more like paying back what I owed to her work. So her work felt, especially in the context of austerity in Puerto Rico and the junta and then Maria, right? Her work felt like it was, I think as she put it, in anti-social democracia, right? How can we imagine a way forward now that the state is actually not going to do anything for us? So to me, she felt like a model, right? Not just herself, but the people she was working with, Amanda for La Impresora, right? Xavier Barcalcer for Atarraya. They were modeling a way, right, forward based on mutual care, right? Interdependence, right? Rootedness in community and in the land, right? So to me, that was a different kind of translation project, obviously because she was Puerto Rican and someone that I knew from our time in Europe, but more so because it felt like an honor, right? To just, not just an honor, a responsibility, right? To highlight this work that felt to me, right, as a critic, as someone who knows the field, but also as a poet who collaborates with them, right? I feel lucky to be, right, working in a moment, right, when amid all the horror and the ruin porn, right, in and around Puerto Rico, right, you have this work that's modeling, right, in a different way. And I love that a little bit of that work is rooted in the New Rican Poets Cafe also, and those kind of community history. So it also felt like a continuity, right? She actually started making books in New York with an artist named Tania Torres, who's Puerto Rican as well. And Tania really works from this aesthetics, politics of bookmaking as a healing practice, right? And again, this was 25 years ago, and that was way less common, right? Either for bookmaking to be this cool thing that people do, especially as poets, and for people to be centering healing in the same way. So I love the fact that Nicole was doing her own thing, but it was also informed by what was happening in Mexico and the feminist collective. She was involved there, and with what people like Tania were doing in New York, right? And with what everybody in Puerto Rico was doing. So it felt like she knew Winston Gonzalez before I did, right? And her time living in Mexico and southern Mexico and going around Central America, they'd connected, I think, at a festival or so it felt like also she was building bridges of the kind that have become more and more important in my work, right? How to think of translation less in terms of extraction, particularly, extraction from the global south into the global north to gain access and get prizes and so on, and more in terms of building bridges that go both ways, right? How did what was happening in a New Rican context, right, become part of what made Nicole's work possible, and in turn, right, how the fact that she published Edwin Torres with Atarraya, right? So thinking of these kind of redes hemisféricas, these networks, right, that really modeled also a space beyond these disciplinary formations of either U.S. ethnic studies over here or Latin American studies over there. Right. So it felt bigger than poetry. It felt like just mapping this emerging formation, which I think interests me. That's part of what I try to do in the New Rican book, is say, here's this thing that's been going on for a long time, but I think I'm always drawn to how can we bring our bodies and bring the full meaning of what we do into the work, right? And understand ourselves as part of a broader collectivity. I think I understand now that that's not work that the institution teaches you. Right. And I think a part of me resents that, right? Resents is a strong word, but how unfortunate that we take all these talented young people, right? And we instrumentalize their creativity and their intellect, right? To produce all these incredible things, right? To be judged by, university metric, which is fine, and there's a place for credentialing and all that. But what happens if you give young people just the chance to build their own bridges, right? You end up with things like the early New Rican Poets Cafe, right? Or La Impresora, right? And I think it's, as I've evolved in my career and gotten tenure, I think pedagogy has become more important. I love just inviting Nicole via Zoom or in person when she's in New York to teach my students a bookmaking workshop and just remind them all you need is paper. That's all. And that's not new to her. She got it from the cartoneras in Argentina, right during their moment of austerity, and put her own spin on it. Yep. So the sense that there are knowledges, right? Poetry isn't just the kind of institutional forms or the lyric, right? Yeah. All that's great, but it's also a kind of social practice that works across media, that thinks about our individual embodiment, but also collectively embodied futures.
Which is, this is something I was hoping to talk with you about, is the incredible stewardship and care and generosity that you have shown for years, really editing for Mandorla and the work you're doing with the Latinx Project at NYU and your annual, we all look forward to the Treintena when it drops, which I think you said is next week for Poetry Month. Where you do
gotta get back to the hotel
30 micro reviews. I mean, it's so much work to read all those books and write all those really carefully wrought, like beautiful, thoughtful reviews, kind of presenting them. And I'm thinking that, this kind of ties together maybe what you're saying earlier about Wokitokiteki being kind of a social practice in some ways, and an embodied and grounded and rooted and placed practice. And that translation can be that as well, partly with Nicole's model too, of bookmaking as a social practice and as a way of creating community, that translation can do that too. And I think you show that as well in this kind of editing, curating, stewarding, mentoring, and cultivating and nurturing that you do, which is so generous and so generative. And
And I don't know anybody who's doing what you're doing, you know, like really, and you're getting the word out about what people are up to. It's really important work.
I think it's what we do. I don't know. Maybe it's because I'm aware that I wouldn't be where I am, right, without other people doing similar work that I benefited from. So, you know, all the way back to someone like Pedro Pietri, right, who didn't exactly have access to a ton of institutional capital, right? But I remember him, he was going to do a residency at a space called New Dramatists, right? I think in maybe Gramercy, Chelsea, that area. And he just asked me, hey, you want to open for me a New Dramatist? I'm like, whoa, I was totally new. I'm like, me, really?
That's amazing.
So that sense of generosity is like, you know, and he'd be, you know, the kind of people who just show up at your open mic just to support, right? Tato La Viera, the same way, right? Would just show up at the open mic and like, you're Tato La Viera, you could be getting paid to do a gig and you're here at my open mic in East Harlem, right? Just like supporting the community. So I think, obviously scholar, someone like Juan Flores, or my colleague Arlene Davila, right? I will go to the most, to me, obscure art exhibit in the South Bronx, right? And I'm like, ooh, this looks really interesting. And someone else told me, oh, you just missed Arlene. She left 15 minutes ago.
Amazing. Yeah.
She's like, wow, you know, so I think there's that, the sense you really literally can't do the work that you do if the New Yorker isn't going to cover it, right? So if we don't, you know, cultivate our own community networks, and I think obviously Arlene's vision with Latinx Project has been decisive in that regard. I'm glad to do, you know, the La Treintena column, but it's the least I could do considering, right, just the work that's gone in to build out a space like that. I'm editor-in-chief of Interventions now. Right. Obviously, I learned a lot from Mandorla, but that was really, you know, Kristen and Roberto's work. Well, I was, you know, honored to be able to contribute to it. But other folks, thinking someone like Rigoberto Gonzalez, who was very important to me early on. I remember when I put out a book called Cool Logic, Logika Cool, and so there was a couple of things in PR, didn't really do a whole lot. And there was one review in the El Paso Times, Rigoberto Gonzalez, right?
Very nice.
And I actually, the two gigs that saved my life, right, you know, which, you know, paid me decently at the time, very generously, I should say, at the time. One was Rigoberto, one was Francisco Aragon, right? So two people who have been indefatigable champions of Latinx poetry over the past 20 years. So also, you know, two queer, right, you know, figures as well. So I really think, you know, that I benefited from the work of folks like that. So, and when you see folks like Oliver, who we just read with, right, work that feels that urgent and that powerful, then if you have some kind of bandwidth, why would you not use it, right? And I love the fact, I mean, I love, obviously, Oliver's book just was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle, but what if it hadn't, right? If a book that powerful, which has happened with some of the other books that we featured, right? I think in some cases mine has been the only, you know, review, even if it's, you know, along with 30 other books. So I think that's also, I would love to do a little bit less of this, but we need a lot more folks doing this work, right? I think we're living in these glory days of Latinx poetics, right? And it doesn't feel like there's enough critics or just folks at institutions, folks at foundations who are really paying attention. So to me, that's, you know, the work is too exciting for it to just fall by the wayside, right? But I think also the sense also that the work of the institution is incomplete, right? So obviously you can't do everything, right? But if you have the privilege, right, to have tenure at an elite institution, right, then maybe you can use a little bit of that time to do a little bit less service to the institution and a little bit more service, right, to the community, or to balance that in some way.
You know, and sometimes it's complicated, right, in terms of language politics, in terms of Latinx writing. And I feel like you're really, really positioned in a way because you're totally bilingual. You circulate and publish in both the English speaking world and the Spanish speaking world, and in the US and in Puerto Rico and other places. And I wonder how you see that, like, what's your vision of how that sits today? Because we know, you know, it's been complicated over the last 60 years, over the last 120 years, over the last several hundred years. But just like in thinking about the 21st century and like where we are now with the relationship between writers writing and publishing in Spanish in the U.S. and writing and publishing in English. Of course, all the kinds of mixing in between, which is maybe where you fall. You're in all of these categories with your publications, but different communities that overlap in certain ways and not in others.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of my, one thing I've become more and more interested in, right, is how to think more capaciously about the category of Latinx writing or, U.S. Latinx poetics, to think about work that is primarily or exclusively in Spanish, right? But also, say, work that is primarily exclusively in English, or work that is suburban or rural, that's not set in a barrio. Or, so think that comes, I think, also from the field, right? Knowing that those traditional maps of Latinidad, right, were always, right, reductive, but they feel especially unhelpful now. So to me, that's also understanding myself as an ethnic studies scholar, right, is I can only do the work I do because people in communities like ours fought, right, for there to be access to these institutions. And so that doesn't mean I'm going to do exactly what people outside want me to do. But I think at Latinx Project, we care that we have buy-in from the communities. We try to cultivate those relationships, right? And we understand the mission, right, as to be that bridge, right, to communities. And obviously, Arlene Davila, who founded it, right, with a bunch of us, she has, a specialization in Latinx visual art. And so I try to just keep that little space open for the poets, right, and make sure we have a little place at the table. And again, I think there's, people like Rigoberto have been doing that work a long time. And I think a lot of us have benefited from that work. I think I love Rigoberto in particular because he's someone who has who in turn learned from someone like Francisco X. Alarcón, right, who has kind of Chicano movement, right, a sense of the, Chicano movement history, but also given his own migration history and his sexuality, right, also someone who understands the need, right, for a really, really expansive, right, really expansive horizons, right, of what these traditions, need to consider. And so I think having learned from folks like that, I think we need to keep the spaces that we have, right, and keep opening others. And I think also there's something also about New York there also. So I think as New York has evolved, right? I think I'm so excited whenever we get students working on Mexican New York, right? More and more, and that's as it should be, right? Hopefully at some point we'll get to the point where we have folks working on, Central American and South American New York City, right? As a matter of course, right? So those communities have always been in New York, right? But they haven't always had the the kind of institutional access, right? And so excited by the work of scholars like Pablo José López Oro, his book on Garifuna, New York City, right? So I think it's also just being in the field, and knowing, right, that Afro-Latinx studies, right, or thinking also who is marginalized within kind of hegemonic Latinidad historically and in the present moment. So Black people, Indigenous people, trans people, undocumented people, disabled people, right? And thinking, okay, if we answer to our communities, then we have to think about who are the most vulnerable among us, right? And also what epistemologies, right? What formations, what counter-institutional histories, right, emerge from those struggles, right? So, I think it's easy to be inspired when you're surrounded by so many brilliant people. So,
well, maybe one quick question to conclude, but maybe it's not a quick question. I don't know. So we'll do as much as we can. I wanted to ask you about your relationship to the Neo Barroco.
Oh, great!
So back to your writer hat, right? And you had I think this was in Transversal, and you talk about your own Baroque vernacular. And you're playing, you're punning on Neo Baroque and Neo Barroco, Neo Barroso. Perlongan was, making that pun as well, but also neo-Baroque in an austerity age. That's your pun. That's all you. And I'm curious if you could talk about how do you see your relationship to the tradition, the Latin American tradition of the neo-Baroque, and then what does that mean for you as you're writing now? Is that a conscious kind of dialogue for you, or are you just playing with these terms and you reject that moniker, which is cool too?
The vernacular and the Baroque. Shout out there to the great Efraín Barradas, a really important critic, Puerto Rican critic, who's written a lot about New Rican poetry. And in a comment on my first book, the self-published Las Flores del Mal, right? He had this point about how the Baroque, right, paradoxically, often evolves, right, or devolves if you want, into this new vernacular, right? So the Baroque illuminates the vernacular and vice versa. And I was like, ooh,
that's good.
I like that a lot, right? Efraín is brilliant. So I think, Baroque and vernacular, those two terms matter to me enormously, right? And then of course the Neo-Barroco was always in there. I studied with the great Rubén Ríos Ávila at the University of Puerto Rico, Rio Piedras, and he's a specialist on the Neo-Baroque the Neo-Baroque in all its queer fabulosity.
Yeah.
So I think exploring that work was really important. And then of course you have Perlongan and the No Barroso, right? Yeah. So I was interested in also the inflection, right, of that Neo-Baroque that's also gotten institutionalized somewhat, right? So I think of the Barrosos also as a kind of punk, right? Neo-Barroco, right? That is less about the florid or the ornate and more about a kind of density, to maybe pick my high density politics, right? A kind of materiality or density, however you want to think about it. And then of course Neo-Baroque, right? I think in all the way back to high density politics, right? I started thinking about the kind of exhaustion of a certain kind of poetics of the city, right? So I think I've always been, I think there's a cliche of the modernist city in ruins, right? To echo, the wasteland, my friend, I should say, Cecilia Rangel, who has a book on ruins and modern poetry. So I'm thinking about the ruins of form in a way. Yeah. And I think about, could the Baroque be more than an aesthetic, right? And could it be a kind of ethics of almost demanding the aesthetic amid its ruin, right? Maybe it's all Walter Benjamin. I feel like I was an avid reader of Benjamin.
But it's also Perlongan,
of course,
right? Because he himself, very political, right? I mean, one of the great poems of the 20th century, Cadáveres.
Of course, yeah.
Right? All the bodies that are in plain sight during the dictatorship where disappearances are a daily occurrence in Argentina. That poem is considered like a foundational neo-Baroque poem, and yet it is deeply, indelibly political. There's no question, right? And also his queerness and his activism, his queer activism.
I think I was also thinking about just a certain kind of necropolitics on the less queer and more abstract sense. The Haroldo de Campos, who was also kind of a neo-Baroque writer, right? The sense of just the corpse that gets reanimated. But then I was thinking one of the books that really haunts me, right, that I'll teach is eminent, can I say the other word, right, Jaime Manrique, eminent M word, right, and he has this great chapter, I think, on Reinaldo Arenas, right, so on his personal relationship with Reinaldo Arenas, since it's really, he shows the objection, how difficult Arena was, but also just how unfair, right? Just obviously the AIDS pandemic, the devastation, right, of racialized, right, queer Caribbean diasporic bodies, right, and so there's a sense also for me that I think I really mean broke. I was thinking. It's hard to know because I was improvising. I was improvising when I did this. Who knows what I actually meant, right?
It's good though. It's good. It sticks.
But I think I have been thinking, okay, look at someone like Arenas. Okay, we've all seen the movie, right? We know the legend, but if you read Manrique's Crónica of his time with him, is someone who like died in a pretty dire, kind of broke, right? Broke, and with a key aspect of his work, specifically that his New York writings, right, kind of forgotten, right? So I'm also thinking about that, right? How is the excess, right, of the Baroque not going to save you, right? So as I mentioned, that's been my own evolution as a writer. Is I love architectures of form, I love the virtuosity, I love the excess, and then I'm like, you know what? So what's that going to do for you, right? At the level just of like body, mind, right? I really haven't mentioned Aurora Lemons Morales, right, and the more women of color feminist, right? Tradition that's really that I really come back to over the past decade or so. But that's like part of it is like, okay, what's the point of if we're all broke, what's the point? That sounds like a very moralistic argument. I don't mean it in a joyless way, because there's still, let's find the joy in these like formal audacity, right?
Right.
And maybe they're the person I always love is I love like Sardui's queer decimas, because I'm a fan of the decimas. I'm like, those decimas are just so punk, so crusty, and they're so like elegant and shimmering at the same time, right? So their broke is also like broken down, right? So the sense that there's this beautiful architecture, but it's always falling apart on itself, It's unsettled, right? So thinking about the unsettled architecture, even when it's a poem that's written in a traditional form. I remember interviewing for a job, I won't say which one, right? Creative writing job, and they asked me, well, you talk about experimental poetry, but you're writing all these like rhyme stanzas, and I'm like, well, rhyme forms, closed forms can be open too, can be performed in open ways, right? So I think it's also about reanimating, right, poetic form, right, where even in that closed form breaks down and opens up into something else, right? The corpse, right, the cadáver, right, of the skeleton, or the formal skeleton of the poem gets reanimated and transformed and re-embodied into something else.
This funny way, I feel like we've come full circle to the Woki-Toki-Teki, the way you were talking about that, right? And that also that contrast that produces.
Absolutely.
Right? So
but definitely, Perdonget is there, right? Lesama. Oh, absolutely. I shouldn't talk Lesama. El Roquedal, that's in a bunch of my Woki-Toki-Tekis, which is La Expresión Americana. That sense of like, what vision of the Americas do I not find ideological, instrumentalized, reductive, opportunistic? And the one I keep coming back to is the image of the Roquedal, which how do you even try that? The rocky place, the craggy place, right? And so when I did my Islote poetics essay on Nicole Cecilia and Joanne Kiger, I was thinking very much of that craggy place. I mentioned it in my Williams essay. So it's a very kind of Glissantian also, right? What is that space where maybe it's an outcropping in the sea, and it's not really land and it's not really sea. It's just like, it's
another place,
spiky, and you can kind of walk on it, but you can't. So Woki-Toki-Teki is possible, but you're always submerging upon yourself.
And maybe related to Roque Dalton.
Raquel Rivera.
There you go.
I didn't talk about Roque and Roque Dalton. That's a good one. Yes. So definitely Lesama is there. Who else? Lamborghini, who I played around with for a while. Yeah, Lamborghini kind of messed me up early on. I translated like a few of his poems for Mandorla back in the day. Yeah. And then somebody else ended up doing the whole book. I'm glad, because I'm like, the Roca was like punk enough. I'm like that punk and that radically queer. Oof. And with all that theory, all that psychoanalysis, right? So, but so badass, right? So, so I think a lot of that writing just, helped me think through a queerness that was based on a craggy or a Roquedal sense of embodiment. Yeah. Right. So the body as a not fully knowable, but not also fully unknowable. Right. So there was an era, I don't know, that's like the very 90s into the 2000s when I was taking that class with Esteban Munoz, right, where it was like either Munozian utopia or the kind of queer negativity that he was responding to, right? With a very trendy, trendy psychoanalytical negativity, right? And, maybe it's just like a craggy place, right? That's accidented and that hurts when you walk, right? But you can also, from there, you can submerge yourself into the sea. I don't know. I come back to that metaphor of that. And I also love it because for Lezama, it's a non-continental, right? It's also like the outcropping of the continent. So it brings me closer to the archipelago, closer to closer to a kind of interconnected islandness that feels like also where I walk. I should add that should have been the literal answer. Hello, I'm walking on Randall's Island, which is this little, this very complicated space because it has a settler history. It has, it seems like it has a slave history. I haven't done the whole, most, it would be surprising if it didn't, right? It was used at various points, it's still as a mental hospital. So it has a history in terms of all these, right? Of the management of all these undesirable bodies, which I go into in Neural C, right? So this was the place I walked around because it was right by my house in the South Bronx, where I did a lot of these walkie-talkie improvisations. So I'm like, where am I? I'm right in between Manhattan, Harlem, Queens, and the South Bronx, but I'm in none of them. I'm this other place. What is that other place? And it's an island, even though it's two islands that got infilled together. And it's an island that's housed, right? All these like marginalized bodies, right? That need to be managed by the state or managed by empire. Yeah, absolutely. So I think I'm not surprised that you'd have a lot of, brokenness, right? And a lot of cragginess, right? Both in terms of just the moment that we're living in as a Boricua, but also just the physical space. So maybe we'll do a Randall's Island walk. And there's a sewage treatment plant, and it's a fascinating space, right?
Well,
I love we ended on sewage.
I know. I think that's where we were.
Well, so sue me.
Oh.
I think when you get into a bad pun, I think it's time to start wrapping it up.
Yeah. No, thank you so much for taking this time to talk to me. I know we could talk all day long, and I hope we will. But
can I do one of you next?
Yeah, totally.
I want the real story behind the Eurotopia poem.
Oh yeah, you got it. The real story.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
And also how you did the research for
the Abecedarian.
Yes.
It's all truth. It's all truth. Nothing's made up. Yeah.
Wow. And also, how did you steel yourself to write about Vichy Stein like that?
Oh, that's a different question.
Yeah.
Yeah. I had to kind of hold my nose sometimes, but yeah.
So it's your Daroca moment. Where
It's a little bit like that.
I'm drawn to this. I'm not going to cancel it. But this is taking a lot out of me.
Yeah. But I think, I do think it's important. Part of my feeling about doing that project is that it's important to remember and analyze and commemorate and think about the complicated writers too, and the complicated work, and if we only focused on work whose politics we agreed with, we'd forget about history and not understand how we get from A to B in so many moments, like during World War II.
Especially in modernism, but that's a pretty short list of modern.
Exactly. It's,
the non-cancelable modernists, go.
Right. Exactly. But thank you. But thank you for this. Thank you for this conversation. We'll keep talking, and we can turn the tables next time.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you. Gracias.
Yep.